So this video is, I suppose, in conjunction with my last video, Is Britain Broken? Which, like I said, is a very sweeping statement, and I'm reluctant to say that, but I do understand where it comes from. I do understand why people say that. I just think that you have to think, okay, if you're saying Britain's broken, by extension, you're saying other countries are better. Well, other countries are better in some areas, but I mean, some of my subscribers, this is just an example, some of my subscribers the other day were talking about Japan in the live stream. And I see where they're coming from. My overall impression of Japan is a positive one, particularly the low crime rates. That's very appealing. But remember, Japan has a high suicide rate. They also have, I think the way they address mental health is not good. They seem to have a situation where they think, well, better cover it up. Don't show emotions, don't show. That seems to be very much a thing in Japanese culture, and I do think it is one of the contributing factors to their high suicide rate. It's a wealthy country, it's a clean country, it's a country where people do care about community and society, and they've low crime rates. And it's an ally of the UK. Geopolitically, we're very close to Japan. That's all good, but it's not a perfect society, and no society is. If you look at some of our European neighbours, France, Germany, etc., they have very similar issues that we do regarding frustration over migrants and integration. Threat of Islamic extremism is a problem in other European countries. If we look at the United States, I mean, I even need to go into that. Even other countries in the Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, I'm sure you'll find plenty of Canadians who are politically disillusioned. Um, so there's no country that's perfect. And I'm talking about developed countries. So you can imagine whatever problems we have in the UK, believe me, they will be a hell of a lot worse in some developing countries. Um, so I do think it's also important to put things in context. Now, I want to talk about politics. I want to talk about party politics. Where do I stand in August 2025? I don't really want to say that I'm politically homeless, but really I am. If there were a general election tomorrow, I would honestly struggle to know who to vote for. But far from being apathetic, it's the opposite. It's precisely because I care so much about politics and society's problems that I do have a dilemma. Because when I look at every political party, every major political party, right, I'm talking about parties that have a realistic chance of getting at least a single MP. Okay, other parties I don't count because they just, until they get a single MP, they're not relevant. So talk about the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, Reform, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the SNP. Right, they're really the parties that we're talking about. Have I missed anyone? I don't think so. So those six parties, and one of them, the SNP, I didn't mention Plaid Cymru because it's even smaller than the SNP. Um, the SNP, I'm a unionist. I'm against Scottish independence. I think it would be an utter tragedy if Scotland became independent. And I think that the argument's actually a bit hypocritical because they say we want to rejoin the European Union, but we want to break up with an even older union to do that. It doesn't really make sense. Um, I'm a strong believer in the shared history between England and Scotland. I love Scotland, and I think it would be a tragedy if Scotland became independent. But the SNP right now, although they're the leading independence party, they are in disarray. They've had a real breakdown in recent years, so that's significant because it means that any other referendum isn't going to be on the cards for a long time. Because in order for that to happen, the leading independence party, the SNP, would have to be in a position where they're not infighting, where they're organising. I think they're in serious trouble right now. I think Labour may well make a resurgence in Scotland because reform is unpopular in Scotland. So that'll be interesting to see what happens. The Labour Party, I'm going to try and make this brief because I could make a very long video just talking about this government. I think the problem with Starmer's government is he's managed to polarise everyone. So he's polarised the right because people are convinced Labour hasn't got a grip on the immigration issue, and that's something a lot of people are concerned about. People think Labour's too soft on crime, despite their tough rhetoric. So Labour strategists have tried to pitch to reform voters by statements like saying we're going to deport every foreign criminal. Well, that's just words. It would be good if it actually happens, but until then, it is just words. it's very, very obvious that Labour has conscientiously been trying to appeal to reform voters, but it hasn't been working. That's that. But then on the other side, they have really, really polarized the left because their welfare policies, whatever way it is glossed over, disabled claimants are losing out. And the language that is used, people still feel like they're being criminalised. They feel that this Labour government is just as harsh on the unemployed as the Tories were, maybe even more so, which is appalling. I think Rachel Reeves and Liz Kendall, they shamefully want to pitch to right wing newspapers by looking like they're being tough on the unemployed rather than giving people support they need and understanding that when you are already putting people under pressure, threatening to cut off even more financial support, it's going to cause serious problems for those people. It's going to cause a lot of anxiety. Labour is very aggressive on the sanction culture in the DWP. So I see no difference between Labour and the Tories when it comes to this issue. Um, on the issue of Israel and Gaza, I welcome the fact that Starmer and Lamy have been a lot more outspoken on that recently. We have sanctioned West Bank settlers for engaging in violence. We've sanctioned Israeli ministers, and the government's been very outspoken on Israel. Yet simultaneously, they prescribe Palestine action. Now, I don't say that people who invade an RAF base should get away with it. I think they should be criminally prosecuted. That is criminal damage. It's endangering the lives of those pilots. But I do think it was a mistake to prescribe the entire group the way they did. I mean, they did not prescribe to stop oil, and they done a lot more to affect the public. Why the inconsistency? Um, so yeah, the left also feel polarized because they feel that the government is still not doing enough on Israel. I think the government could go further. We could just completely cut off support to Israel. It's been done before. I mean, cut off arms 100%. No support. Israel can kick up a stink about it, let them. What's happening in Gaza is an abomination. And the truth is, even if we cut it off now, we are seen as complicit because we did support Israel for a long time. But at least, if we done it now, it would be better than continuing to support them in any way. I think that Israel's lost all moral support, in my view. Um, we should not move on what the United States says, or so Vance criticizes us for our stance on Israel. We should point out to JD Vance that we're a sovereign nation. Yeah, but anyway, so Starmer has managed to polarize right and left. A lot of people are concerned about the erosions of freedom of speech. And whilst Labour hasn't created this situation, Starmer is in stubborn denial about it. When this issue comes up, and not just when it's JD Vance raising it, I mean within the country, he takes a stubborn view. Oh, we've long had a tradition of freedom of speech in this country, and he laughs about it. Either he is ignorant or he is willfully ignoring the fact that there is very real public concern out there. Um, and that's something I think that parties in general need to address now. Reform has, the Tories have, but the left wing parties have failed to do so. I've contacted the Liberal Democrats, I contacted the Home Affairs spokesperson and the Justice spokesperson. I still haven't got a reply yet. And annoyingly, I got a reply saying, please direct your email, and then they give me the MP's address. Well, why not put that on the website in the first place rather than give someone the wrong email? But that's by the by. Um, so yeah, Labour. I at this point I'm highly unlikely to vote Labour. I am frustrated with the crime situation. I'm frustrated with Starmer's failure to understand that free speech is something a lot of people are concerned about. So if Labour fails to act on this, then the public, even if it's unfair because Labour didn't create this situation, the public are going to hold them responsible. They're going to hold Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, and the rest of the cabinet responsible for failing to understand that what they need to do, quite frankly, is something radical. They need to abolish non-crime hate incidents altogether. If someone is being harassed, like genuinely harassed, if they're suffering racial abuse or something like that, there's already legislation that can deal with that. I don't see why the police should have any business policing people's opinions. This is a serious problem, and it also relates to my last video about corrosion of public trust. So that's the reason I'm unlikely to vote Labour. Do I think they've got everything wrong? No. I've mixed views on the age of voting being reduced, but if the 16-year-old can vote, it makes no sense to call them a child when they commit a crime. That's clearly a paradox. Um, what else can I say? David's done well. I do welcome the fact they've taken a harder stance with Israel. I welcome the reset. I've said this before with Europe. I think that's a good move. I don't actually think David Lammy's a worse foreign secretary, but their stance on China, again, Labour is ridiculously soft on China, ridiculously out of touch with that issue. The security services have warned the government. Why are they not acting on it? They should absolutely put a block on that Chinese mega embassy. They should close Confucius Institute, and they should make it clear to Beijing that bullying language will change our policy. Because that's the way Beijing acts. We've seen how they treat smaller countries. Basically, they're a bunch of thugs. We cannot we cannot treat a regime like that as if they're a friend or a partner. We need to work with them, but we should make it absolutely clear that we can't be pushed around. And the government is given the impression that we can be pushed around. Now, the Tories, Badenoch hasn't done anywhere near enough to accept why the public voted them out of office. In fact, not just voted them out, but gave them their worst performance ever, since they formed as a political party under Lord Derby. Um, and I don't think it's even Rishi Sunak. I think he just happened to be the unlucky one that happened to be the last Tory Prime Minister. I don't even think Sunak was a terrible Prime Minister in of himself, but I think his government and the Conservative Party made a mess of things. If people are angry and disillusioned now, they were under the Tories as well. It may have got worse, but I think the whole Partygate thing, Adnock has refused to understand. I don't think she's really learned from that. She said, we need to learn from mistakes, but it's time to move on from that. Well, that's a contradiction. That was one of the issues that the public was angry about. The sleaze, the double standards. I think one big problem with the Conservative Party is they do have this arrogant idea that they're born to rule. Now, I welcome some of the things they've said, for example, abolishing non-crime hate incidents, but why didn't they do it when they were in power? So, frankly, the Tories are in a bit of a lame duck position because everything they say to criticise Labour, the obvious follow-up, why didn't you do it when you were in power? So, they've a lot of ground to build up on. Now, reform. This is going to be an interesting one. I'm a centrist. Some of my views are to the right, some are to the left. Reform is quite clearly a hard right party. There's no getting away from that. I don't say far right, I say hard right. I think there is a difference. Um, Reform's big issue is immigration. I am more balanced on that issue. I think we need to control it. I think we need to deport foreign criminals, but I don't agree with the narrative that we should just cut off all immigration, including even legal immigration. Because given half a chance, that's what reform would do. I think that is going to unfairly punish people who have played by the rules and people who are contributing to our society. I mean, as an example, if you have an Indian doctor or a Filipino nurse, why should they be punished? Because others have broken the rules and they are contributing to society. I know there's the argument we should train our own people, and we should, but I just don't agree with cutting off all immigration. The other thing about it is if you have people who have espoused from another country, in the 21st century, this isn't that unusual. Um, why should that's I would argue it's an infringement of their human rights. Say you cannot enjoy love, you cannot have happiness. We're going to make sure that your partner cannot come to the UK. To me, that's a violation of basic human rights. Um, so that's why I think that the immigration issue, I don't entirely agree with Reform's absolute stance to just cut off all immigration. Um, Now, the crime issue, I've said that they're on to something. I've said that if Reform carries this out, I might contemplate voting for them. I have to think very carefully about that. But because again, words are cheap, actions count a lot more. Reform needs to make it clear they're against all crime. So, for example, when right-wing anti-migrant protesters get involved in rioting, they throw things at the police, they threaten to set hotels on fire. If reform really is about law and order, they need to unequivocally condemn that behaviour and support the police in arresting those people. To date, they've given the impression that they're willing to make excuses for that sort of behaviour. When the violence broke out last summer, instead of blaming the rioters, Farage blamed immigration. Now, to me, that says that he is not willing to criticise those who might vote for him just because it's politically inconvenient to do so. If he really wants to be consistent on this issue, he needs to do it across the board. But I do welcome, I mean, he says they're going to be the toughest party ever on law and order. I welcome that because for too long, criminals have got away with too much. Criminals aren't scared of justice. That has to change. So I welcome it, but it also must include young offenders. You know, they get away with far too much. That awful crime in Kent. I want to see a situation where teenage thugs like that face years and years behind bars for what they have done, not just a few years. Um, but there's other areas of reform I don't entirely trust. Foreign policy. Nigel Farage has made no secret of the fact he's a good buddy of Donald Trump, but I think it gets to a point where he's almost sycophantic. I'm not just talking about those photos where he has a big Cheshire cat grin, and I just think that it's not very patriotic to be slavish to the Americans, to be so subservient and pandering to them that it looks like Farage would roll out the red carpet in a blink of an eye just to please Donald Trump. That isn't patriotism, because their whole gist, of course, is being anti-Europe and Brexit. But on foreign policy, I do have trust issues. When Farage repeated Russian propaganda, I had a very big problem with that. And yeah, he was quick to say he didn't support Putin and he condemned the invasion, but it's mixed messages. You can't say that you condemn the invasion, but then basically repeat Russian propaganda by claiming that it was a result of NATO expansion. That's false, actually. The main motivation for the invasion of Ukraine was irredentism, Putin's obsession with reclaiming the Tsarist Empire. And yes, he uses NATO expansion as an excuse. But what Nigel Farage should realise is the only reason NATO's expanded is because sovereign nations like Sweden and Finland have decided they are safer joining NATO. So, as a great patriot and a great believer in self determination and sovereignty, does Farage not support the right of Sweden and Finland to join NATO? It's a contradiction. I don't trust Farage on foreign policy. The thing about reform is they will force, they will argue for back to basics policing. They'll be tough on law and order. At the moment, that's the only thing I can think of to vote for them. It's a very important thing. It is a very important thing, but there's a lot of other areas I'm not sure about when it comes to reform. The Greens, I wouldn't give them the time of day. I think climate change needs to be taken seriously. We need to tackle it. But the Greens, I don't think, are a serious party. The only reason I'm including them here is because they have got a few MPs, and I do think they could take some votes away from Labour. But they've made the decision to support the extremely antisocial subversion tactics of Just Stop Oil. To me, that sends out a very bad message. They're not really a party that aspires to govern. They're a party that are professional protesters. So I really don't give the Greens the time of day. The only reason I mention them is because they have a few MPs. Strange things can happen in politics, so they may be able to grow. If that happens, my biggest concern about the Green Party of England and Wales is if Labour is seen to be soft on crime, the Greens will look like, for criminals, it will be like winning the lottery. The Greens, I think, if Reform says they'll be the toughest party on law and order, I think Greens would be the softest. Then I get to the Liberal Democrats. Now, this is a slightly personal one because I used to be a member of the Liberal Democrats and I stood twice unsuccessfully at council level, although I did improve on my own result the second time around. The Liberal Democrats traditionally were a party I would most likely vote for because they're broadly centrist. They're definitely more to the left than the right, no question about that. And I do give Ed Davey some credit. His party has been outspoken on the issue of how disabled claimants are treated. So I do give him credit for that. Crime, I wouldn't entirely trust them because, like I say, they're more to the left, so they would definitely be pro leniency. You know, would the Lib Dems be in favour of building prison spaces? No. They're likely to be the sort of party that will talk about rehabilitation, ignoring the fact that rehabilitation efforts have already failed. So I don't trust the Liberal Democrats on law and order. I have to say, at local level, the Lib Dems can be quite dirty. They'll put out some very sharp criticism of the Tories and Labour. And when I say sharp criticism, I mean sometimes it's quite dirty politics. They'll use crude cartoons and things like that. I've seen it. It's one thing I don't like. You know, the Liberal Democrats actually have a reputation for being quite unpleasant campaigners in terms of how they approach other parties. So I think they need to change that strategy. Um, I think that I want to be motivated to vote Liberal Democrat, but I don't trust them on law and order. And until I get an answer from my question about their stance on non-crime hate incidents, that to me is a major issue. As a Liberal Party, they should be in the absolute forefront of being against the way non-crime hate incidents are used. As I understand it, their stance is neutral. They are against the police being overzealous, but they still support the use of non-crime hate incidents. Not good enough. I think these things need to be abolished. So long as they exist, freedom of speech is threatened because the police will find an excuse to misuse them. So if I had one question for Ed Davey, I would say, why, as a liberal, are you not more concerned about this? That would be my question for Mr. Davey. That's it. That's and like I say, the SNP, they're in disarray. They're also soft on crime. The Scottish Sentencing Council is pathetic. So I do not trust. If I was in Scotland, I wouldn't vote for the SNP because I'm a unionist anyway. But even leaving that issue aside, I would look at their actual record. They have completely failed on law and order. They've let down victims of crime in Scotland. Because the Scottish Sentencing Council, which is formally independent, but it was set up by the SNP, have utterly failed victims of crime. I would go so far as to say they're a pro-criminal body. So, who do I vote for? I think a lot of time people vote at local level, they look at local candidates. My local MP, I have to say, he's a decent man. I've spoken to him a number of times. He did vote in favour of the government's welfare reforms. He didn't, he responded to the concerns that people had, but did vote that through. And I will remember that when it comes to voting because I think it's morally very wrong. He was arguing that, there will be more support given to disabled claimants, but whatever way that is glossed over, they're losing money, and it's already at a time when they're under pressure. Um, I know that I'm talking about Lewis Atkinson here. Took a hard line on the Yobbery last year and the violent rioting. I support that as well. But, Sunderland's the sort of city where reform could make significant inroads. So I'm going to be watching Lewis Atkinson closely and seeing what sort of positions he takes, because he'll need to get this right. Sunderland's not the sort of place where it is a balancing act. I think it isn't easy being a Labour MP because you don't want to polarize left or right. You are part of the governing party. So I'll be watching Lewis Atkinson closely. I won't 100% rule out voting for him, but I'm not happy about the fact he voted for that bill. But like I say, I've spoken to him on a personal basis. He seems like a decent man. I think he genuinely does care about his constituents. I don't think he doesn't. He always responds to correspondence and social media and stuff, so I will give him that. Um, I think at council level, again, the Liberal Democrats here are pretty active, and I do give them credit. During the pandemic, they actually phoned me to see how I was, not because I was a former party member, just generally. They wanted to check up on people if people needed anything and stuff, so I give them credit for that. But broadly, I think there's going to be a reform government. Well, strange things happen in politics. Strange things happen in politics. Reform could well get into power. At the moment, they have what, five or six MPs? Now, how do you go from six MPs to winning a landslide and getting into government? I can't see it happening in one general election. I think it's possible, not in the next general election, but the general election after that. I think what reform could do is actually do enough to become His Majesty's opposition, and that would be a profound thing. It will really force the Tories to think we're in an awful position here because the Tories have never been in third place on a national scale. I think reform might be able to do that, but there's still enough people out there who don't trust Nigel Farage. There's still enough people out there who don't quite trust reform for them to not. I don't think they'll win the general election, but I think they'll do enough to make significant noise, um, and that can't be ignored. But the question is, how does Labour respond to that? Will the correct response be to take on the issues that Reform is bringing up, or will it be to become Reform light, or will it be to take the total opposite approach? I actually think the best approach that Labour could take regarding Reform is address the issues that they're bringing up, but do it in a Labour way. What I mean by that is don't be Reform light. Don't vilify claimants. Don't vilify migrants. Just show that you're acting on things that people are concerned about. I mean, well, honestly, what I would do with Labour is I would go ahead with the policy to deport foreign criminals, but I would actually take a softer stance regarding welfare, a more compassionate stance, because they're losing left wing support in that area. That's something, I mean, I don't actually think Reform voters are as angry about the welfare issue as they are about the migrant issue. So Labour taking a more compassionate response to that wouldn't necessarily cost Reform votes. In fact, my point about Reform, they are always saying, put the British people before migrants. Well, I would challenge them, okay, prove it. If you want to put the British people first, and do you care about disabled claimants? I'd actually challenge Reform voters on that. Okay, I'll wrap this up. But that's where I'm at. I have concerns about all the parties. Um, as a centrist, you might argue that either the Liberal Democrats or Labour would be the most natural choice, or maybe even the Tories. But I have concerns about all of them. I don't think the Liberal Democrats have done enough regarding standing up for free speech. And as for Islamic extremism, the left wing parties are still in denial about this. They're still far too politically correct. They're still frightened to call it out for what it is, Islamic extremism. The Liberal Democrats, again, should be in the forefront of tackling this because you will not find a more illiberal ideology than Islamist ideology. Ed Davey and his party should be unequivocally saying this country should have no blasphemy laws, and anyone who believes in honour killings has no place in this country. But they're too politically correct, they won't say it. So I think actually the Liberal Democrats have failed to be sufficiently liberal and stand up for liberal values enough. That's my main issue with the Liberal Democrats. But again, often people don't vote necessarily on national level, but on local level. So they look at local candidates, and local candidates don't always necessarily embody what the national party is saying. So for example, local Liberal Democrats who know full well people are angry about crime will talk tough on crime, which is a contradiction from what Ed Davey is saying. You know, and a local Labour MP might be very vocal about non-crime hate incidents being misused because they know local people are angry about that, which will be a contrast to Starmer's refusal to talk about it, etc.